Nicola. I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict. My sobriety date is January 25th, 1989. So I just celebrated this year 30 years of sobriety. I'm born and raised in Hawaii on the island of Oahu. Moved to California about 9 years ago for work. But my upbringing and everything was back home in Hawaii. My mom and my dad got divorced when I was about 6 years old. I have two younger brothers we're all 2 years apart. So my parents went through a divorce. As far as I can remember, there was always a lot of alcohol, drugs, marijuana, cocaine. There was a lot of physical and verbal abuse growing up. My dad, and he did a lot of drinking with that. And I just remember a lot of instability, a lot of craziness, a lot of abuse, us bouncing around from house to house, home to home, staying at aunts and uncles, going between mom and dad through the divorce and all that stuff. Matter of fact, my youngest brother ended up living with one of our aunts for a couple of years during that time. But my mom had met a Marine who became my stepdad, and they did a lot of partying. My mom was on welfare from as long as I can remember, from the time she got divorced, I believe. So we lived on welfare most of our life. My mom had custody of us, and we just went, and went from paycheck to paycheck type of a thing. My stepdad did some jobs here and there, odd jobs. But my mom and my dad were pretty relaxed, pretty low key in that way. But just did a lot of partying. They did a lot of partying, and we got introduced to alcohol and drugs when we were young, as I mentioned. But one of the things that started happening as a result of that lifestyle is that during some of these parties, my mom would make like marijuana brownies, and they'd invite friends that were military over, and they'd be drinking and having a good time. And I remember one incident I was around 8 or 9, where they gave my mom and my stepdad gave us tequila shots with salt and lemon when we were young, and would watch us walk around the house, drunk or stoned. So that was the earliest memory that I have of having any kind of substances in my body and being drunk or stoned, and that would happen, on a regular basis. That's just the way that it was, drinking and using and smoking weed. We had bongs all over the house and everywhere, and we could pretty much get stoned anytime we wanted to, and it was seen as fun. But we hopped around from low income housing to low income housing. I mean, it was just a crazy upbringing, and it wasn't something that I enjoyed. It wasn't something that I just didn't know what to think about it, and that's just the way that it was. And my mom was pretty laid back, so we got away with a lot of things in school, and school wasn't a priority. And as young as I can remember, I was a special ed student. I was always in the special ed classes. I remember times where my dad would, take us for a year or so for school, and he would try and attempt to help me and my brothers, get out of special ed classes, things like that. But his way was, he wasn't a great teacher. So his way was to yell and scream and hit us when we were doing homework. And if we didn't know, what we were doing, we'd get lickings or we'd get hit. We call it lickings back home. We get lickings and yelled at. And that wasn't very encouraging. And it didn't help me learn. I know there were times where I did better just because the fact that he had a regiment and a structure for us us. When we got home, we did homework. Where if I was with mom, we didn't. Um, but it didn't stop. That was kind of the way that it was, and no matter where I went or what school I went to, I was always placed in the special ed classes. And I remember being teased a lot, and that I was stupid and dumb, and I used to be ashamed to walk out of those classes because I didn't want to end up getting teased. And that's just kind of the way that I grew up. We did a lot of back then there wasn't any cell phones or iPads and things of that nature. So we used to always go out and play outside and make slingshots, and we did have BB guns, and we used to go and try and shoot animals. And we had a river behind my dad's house, a stream, and we used to go back there and have our own water park slide and go in our underwear and do things like that. Or we'd go down to Waikiki Beach, or where my mom was living. We just go down to the beach. That was something that we did. So surfing, bodyboarding, boogie boarding, things of that nature was stuff that we did growing up, along with all the alcoholism, the drug addiction, the abuse, and everything else that was going on. So when I got into ninth grade, that was when I started hanging around friends that was drinking and using drugs, and that was where I made the conscious decision to pick up the drink and the drug. There was a couple of incidences that I was made aware of, and I remembered one, but the other was at my grandma's house or my dad's house. It was a really old house, and I remember they had said that one of the windows was wide open, and during that time, I was bouncing on the bed, and I bounced right out of the two-story window and landed on a bed of grass, and almost hit the faucet that was there. And another one, same thing at my grandma's house. I went around looking in the yard with a hammer, and I found this Budweiser beer bottle in the yard, and I went and hit it, and it exploded. And one of the pieces flew into my right eye, so I'm blind in my right eye, and I have a scar that runs right across my pupil. And that's the kind of stuff that we were around and that we grew up in. When I started to, there was some sexual abuse too that ended up happening with a cousin, and I was really close with this cousin. And he, we were pretty much taking care of and watching each other. We had an uncle that was home and stuff like that, but they would pretty much let us go and go do whatever we needed to do. But there wasn't a lot of supervision. So me and my cousin, we were really tight, and then there was a lot of this sexual stuff, and I didn't know what to do with that or what that was about or anything like that, but it was just something that happened. And that also messed me up as I got older. I didn't know what to do with all of that. But that cousin was about a year or two older than I was, and one year we had gone with my grandfather, my dad's dad, to Maui, and my grandfather had sent us back a day early, and he said he was going to be coming home. And during that, when he came home, my grandfather ended up having a heart attack at the Honolulu airport and died. And I remember my cousin telling me that he wanted to be with Grandpa. I didn't know what he meant by that at the funeral, but a few months later, my cousin ended up hanging himself outside of our house on a clothesline pole, and his feet were just an inch or two away from the ground, and he ended up dying. And that year, we had, within a matter of 6-9 months, I had my grandfather pass away, my cousin passed away, and then the uncle, my grandmother's brother, who kind of watched over us at home, he passed away too. And we think he passed away from a broken heart, but there was a lot of grief, going on during that time, and I was about 11, 12 years old, and I remember the family just, my dad's family just a lot of grieving going on. And us kids were kind of left to kind of, grieve on our own, and the adults were devastated by the losses, and that was kind of it. So by the time I was in ninth grade, I started hanging out with some friends that were drinking and using, and I got into smoking weed and drinking every now and then, and we'd go to school stoned every day, and we'd be cutting out of classes and all that kind of stuff. And we got into stealing, and I did start stealing when I was younger. I used to steal candy and stuff out of the store, and I remember when I was about 9, I also stole a boogie board out of a store because I didn't have one and all my friends did. So I went and stole one out of a store, and watched how the cashiers would allow big items out of the store, and I did the exact same thing they did, and I walked out of the store and put the boogie board in my mom's trunk. And it was when I went back in to go find my mom that I got nabbed by the security guard. And I had some family and uncle that was a police officer in the same area, so I was able to get away with it, kind of a thing. But stealing was a big deal. So when I started hanging out with these friends, and I used to steal money from my family and all that stuff all the time, and they used to blame a couple of other people or cousins of mine and my brothers and stuff like that, because they just didn't think that I would do it, because I had this I was so quiet and such a good boy persona type of a thing, and I was the one that was stealing all the money. I'm sure that they might have, but I stole a lot of money. And during my height of my addiction, when I was about 18 years old and stuff, I'd gone into harder stuff besides alcohol and drugs. I was doing just about anything I could get my hands on. And to support my habit, one of the things that I did was my grandmother had a Chinese cat piggy bank up on her shelf in her living room. And it was a pretty big tank, piggy bank, or Chinese piggy bank. And she only used to put, from as young as we could remember, she only used to put $50 and dollar coins in that piggy bank. And by the time I had gotten to it, probably within a matter of 6 months, maybe less, I had drained that piggy bank to nothing, and it was almost full. So I don't know, there must have been a $2-3 grand in that piggy bank, and I ended up taking it all. Slowly but surely, I would take that piggy bank off the shelf, go in the back room, shake out 20, 40, 60 bucks, $100, whatever I needed, and I would go and do that whenever I could. And next thing you know, there wasn't any money in it. And one day my grandmother went to go put money in it, and it made a totally different sound when she dropped the coin in there, and that was it. They knew it was me, and she knew it was me. And my grandmother's house was always open. The doors were never locked, and anybody could come over, and she always had food on the table, in the house, and anybody could come and eat, and and all this kind of stuff. I'd never known my grandmother to tell anybody you're not welcome at this house. And I believe I might have been the first one. And she told me that I couldn't come there anymore. And she was pissed. And that's the kind of stuff that I was doing. And I was stealing. When I was in high school, a lot of my friends, we used to go and make friends with people that had money, and we'd go over to their house and their parents weren't home, and stuff like that, and befriend them. And we used to steal. We used to go back when nobody was home, and we'd steal the electronics, or we'd steal whatever we could and get money so we could get high. And that's the type of partying we did, and that's man. I was an angry alcoholic drug addict, and I blamed everybody and everything, from God to my parents to the life that I had to anything. Anything to fuel me to get drunk and loaded, I did it. And to me, it was real. I had a screwed up life because of the way that I was brought up. I had a screwed up life because of my dad. I had a screwed up life because of my mom. I had a screwed up life because of everything. It didn't even matter. But they were at fault for why my life was so screwed up. I took no responsibility for anything. It was always somebody else's fault for why I was the way that I was. And all the hurt and the pain and the loss and being called a dummy and I'm stupid and I'm dumb and all those core beliefs, all those things became core beliefs and values that I had about who I was and what I was, and the only thing that could deal with that and bury that was alcohol and drugs. Alcohol and drugs. It didn't even matter. And the more alcohol and drugs I did, the number I got, and the more I didn't care about people, places, and things, and I had no conscience. I did whatever I needed to do, and I got into hanging out with other alcoholic drug addicts and dealing drugs, into prostitution, all that stuff. Hopping around from hotel room to hotel room, sleeping in the cars, all that. All that good stuff that comes with being an alcoholic and a drug addict, I lived it. And I barely graduated from high school, and I don't even remember my graduation. I was so screwed up on alcohol and drugs. And it just continued. And so by the time I was 20 years old, I was homeless. I was living in a car that wasn't even my car. It was a friend's car that I had borrowed and I never took back. And I was driving around and living in this car and sleeping in the car because I had nowhere to go. The only thing that was on my mind was, how was I going to get drunk or loaded again? How was I going to get money so that I could get high? So in January of 1989, I went to my mom, and when I was in, I think it was, maybe about 13, 14 years old, my mom had told us that she had cancer, and she had breast cancer. And I remember watching her go through those experiences, and I remember her being sick, and I remember her having to go into the, the chemo and all that kind of stuff. And I remember her going through having one breast removed, and then, going to chemo again and all that kind of stuff. And then a couple of years later, it comes back, and, they had to remove the second breast. And I watched my mom go through 7 years of battling cancer. And I was so messed up and so loaded and drunk that I did nothing to support her. I did nothing to be there for her, to help her in any way. I was so focused on me and what I was feeling and what I was going through that I had no motivation to help her. But I would just watch, and I would watch what she went through. And at 20 years old, when she was being taken care of by her sister, she was already on her deathbed. They had her on pain pills and was just trying to make her comfortable and all that stuff. And I remember in early January, I went to her and I was like, I need money. And I went to her asking her for money. And I hadn't seen her in about a year and a half, maybe 2 years by that time. And she started to cry, and she started to plead with me to go into a program. And at the time, my uncle, my mom's brother, was in a program called A Second Chance. It was a sober living, actually, for men. And it was run by a guy named Frank. And she said, your uncle is doing good. And, my uncle used to party with my mom then. And he was an alcoholic drug addict dad too, and he was sober. I think he was about 9 months sober. I think 6 to 9 months, somewhere in there. And she said, why don't you go with Uncle? And he's sober now, and all this kind of stuff. And she's crying and begging me to go. And I just told her, I said, I just need the money. Just give me the money. I gotta go. And she gave me $100, and I went and got loaded. And 2 days later, I was back at the same place again. And I had nowhere to go. No one cared really. I didn't. No one else did. So I called my mom and I said, okay. But I was January 24th, 1989, and that was the last day that I ever picked up the drink and the drug. And when I went over to my aunt's house where my mom was at, my uncle, Frank, who ran the sober living, and about 4 other guys came and did a 12-step call. And they were talking to me, and I swear I don't remember anything that they said. All I remember during that experience was, what the hell is all these guys doing here? My mom's crying, begging me to go, and the only reason I went was because my mom asked me to go. And so the next day, I went with them, and I slept on the top bunk. My uncle had a bunk in his room, and I slept on the top bunk with him. And the next day, they got me up, gave me some clothes, jeans, and some shoes, and a shirt, and they come on, we're gonna go work. And Frank had a construction company, and so we went to work. He was doing a demolition job on one of the Waikiki hotels, and he detoxed me working. A detox of alcohol and drugs, busting my butt, doing demolition work on a hotel. And that was that was brutal. At least, today they put them on medication, they put people going on detox. Back in the day, it was hardcore, man. And I sweated like a pig, and I was sick for a few days, and he put me right back on at work again. I just I sweated my detox, and we'd go to meetings at night, and 12-step meetings, AA meetings, and my first home group that they took me to was one that they were running called Walking Tall, and that was my first home group. And I remember going to the meetings, and they would say, any newcomers and all this stuff, and I wouldn't stand up and say anything, and one of the guys would say, hey, you gotta stand up. You gotta tell them you're a newcomer and that you're an alcoholic and a drug addict. And I was like, yeah, but I'm not an alcoholic and a drug addict. He said, that's all right. Just stand up and say it anyway. And those are the types of things that I did. So I was working, and I was going to meetings, and I was at a sober living. And that's what we did every day. Go to work, go meetings, go to work, go meetings. And we did step study once a week. And I did not know what the heck I was doing. I didn't know what was happening. I just was following what everybody else was following, and there was a ton. He had a bunch of houses that were full with men, and the house that I was in, I think, had about 16 of us in that house, maybe 12, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, yeah, maybe about 14 people in one house. We had all bunk beds in the house, and all men, and we had chores, and we had all this stuff, and we had to deal with everybody's crap, and this and that, and so I was in sober living for about a year and a half, almost 2 years. And during that first 30 days, I started building these relationships with these friends. And Frank was a very active, service-oriented type of guy and sponsor and stuff like that. And he was my first sponsor. And so we did a lot of cooking for luau's and parties. And we did a lot of service work. We did a lot of camping. We went outer islands and picked opihi, which is a shellfish that's attached themselves to the rocks. We did a lot of things like that, and just he kept us busy and active, And we worked the steps to the best of our ability. I knew nothing about what the heck they were talking about. But around 30 days clean, I got a call from Frank and from my dad and Frank, and they said, to come over to where my mom was. And so Frank took me over there, and I saw my dad, and I was just like, oh, what's my dad doing here? place, wrong time, and the fear that everybody had was that I was going to run, that I was going to use that to go back to drinking and using again. And you know, they were probably correct. I was just shocked at the whole fact because, you know, it was my brother, and out of the three of us, he was, you know, the best out of us three. He just graduated from high school, and he had, you know, a good head on his shoulders, and he was very creative and had some goals, and, you know, what he was going to do and what he wanted to do and all that kind of stuff. And he had died that day. And I remember going to his funeral and making a promise at his coffin that I would never pick up the drink and the drug again, you know, and that I was gonna, you know, do good. And I was sincere about that. I really meant that. I really meant that promise. And that kept me sober, you know. And I stayed sober just on that. And I remember my first sponsor, Frank, telling me, he said, Ben, don't use this as an excuse, but use it to make you stronger to want to stay clean and sober. And for whatever reason, that made sense to me. That absolutely made sense to me, and that's what I did. And about almost 60 days, maybe 45 days later, my mom finally passed away of cancer. So I had my brother and my mom die in my first 90 days of my recovery. And they were, you know, my mom and my brother, you know. And I did the exact same thing at my mom's funeral and made a promise to her that I would stay clean and sober. So those two deaths kept me around the program, the 12-step program, and stay clean and sober. Those two deaths helped me do that because I was totally unaware of how powerful, how cunning, baffling, and powerful the disease of alcoholism and drug addiction really was. And those promises that I made kept me sober. And there wasn't anything, man, I swear, I was on a pink cloud. There wasn't anything that anybody could do that was going to knock me off, that was going to take me back. I had friends of mine that I got sober with that were relapsing and going back, and a few of them had even died because they OD'd, you know, during my first year or two. And it was crazy. And I did that, and Frank had opened up a treatment center when I had about a year or so, or about maybe 6 months. When I had about 6 months, he opened up a treatment center for men and women, and I started working there with him as a driver and stuff like that, and house manager. And I was still living at Sober Living, and I got into a relationship with my first sponsor, Frank's niece, who was going through a divorce. That whole thing of boy meets girl on AA campus, and she was a couple of years older than I was, and had 2 kids that were 4 and 2 years old, and I thought she was absolutely beautiful. And she was a local girl from Hawaii, Portuguese Hawaiian, and I was like, wow. And I tried to go out with her and all this kind of stuff. And one of the things that I came to find out is that a lot of the things that I were in my drinking and using, I still was in my sobriety. Because at that point, the only thing that I did was not drink and use. All of my defects of character, my shortcomings, all of that was still alive and well. I was still angry. I was still resentful. I was still this. I was still that. I was insane. I was just clean and sober. That's literally what I was. I was a dry drunk. And I didn't know. I had a hard time comprehending all of the things that they were saying. But I did understand, I guess in one way, I understood when my sponsor said, Ben, you can do whatever you want to do in sobriety, just don't pick up the drink and the drug. And that kind of simplicity for me early on at 20 years old was foundational. And I understood that no matter what went on, no pick up the drink and the drug. No matter how bad I was, no matter what behaviors I acted out in, no matter what, just don't pick up the drink and the drug. And I took it year and a half or so, I started visiting old dealer friends of mine and drug addict friends of mine by myself. And, when you're in the program, they say never do a 12-step call alone. You always go with somebody. And I was saying, but, I got a year now, and, I can go and visit these people by myself and all that kind of stuff. Well, one visit led to 2 visits, then that visit led to 3 visits. And by the time the 4th visit came along, I already had, drug in hand, ready to get high. And if it wasn't for that drug dealer friend of mine telling me stop, I would have got loaded that day. And all of those promises, those sincere promises that I made, wasn't strong enough. I did nothing to change Ben, except not drink and not drug. And as a result of that, I almost got high and drunk. And that was a spiritual experience, if you want to call it. As a result of that, I realized that no matter what I was doing, no matter how many meetings I went to, no matter if I had a sponsor or not, no matter if I had the fellowship, I had not done anything to change me. Truly me, then, inside, the core. I did nothing. And I almost got loaded behind it. And it was at that moment that I realized that I was going to need to work my ass off to find out why, to start learning about me. And that was when I believe that was when I admitted complete defeat, that I was an alcoholic and a drug addict. And I had a kind of willingness to do whatever I needed to do that I never had before. And that's what happened with that. And I just went on this mission, man, of I need to find out, I need to learn about me. I was getting into step studies, big book studies. I was like wanting to learn. I was opening up the dictionary. I was asking old timers. I was started hanging out with old timers, and I started wanting to learn and all this kind of stuff. And that girl, my sponsor's niece, we became, boyfriend and girlfriend, and we started living together and all this kind of stuff. And I just wanted to learn. And Frank had asked me if I wanted to be a counselor, and so I ended up becoming a counselor, for his program called A Second Chance. And so we're going into 2 years of sobriety, and I'm sober, and I'm living with my girlfriend and her kids and our kids, and I'm working at a treatment center, and I'm plugged into the program more than I've ever been before because I wanted to, and life was going good, And there was during that time, my sponsor was going through some tough times, and I ended up changing sponsor, and I went to this guy that had a family, and I wanted what he had, and he had about 5, 6, 7 years more than I did, and I wanted what he had, so I asked him to be my sponsor, and I wanted to learn how to be a man, and I wanted to learn how to be a dad, and I wanted to learn how to be a husband, or the best boyfriend that I could, and that man taught me a lot of that stuff, taught me a lot of things about how to do all those things, and at the same time stay plugged into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. If there's been one steady, foundational, concrete, stable thing that's been in my sobriety over the past 30 years, it's been the basics of the program. And what I mean by the basics of the program is, meetings. And till today, I go to 4 meetings a week. My home group is the Eye Opener meeting here in San Juan Capistrano, California. And I'm in service at my home group. I'm the chair for the steering committee. And I'm in a step study, and I work the steps with my sponsees. I sponsor a few men. I practice prayer meditation every morning. When I get up early, I'm the first one up in my home at 4:30, and I spend some time doing prayer, my reading, meditation, and I do that. So meetings, service, sponsor. My sponsor now has 47 years of sobriety, and step work, And to me, that's the basics. And if I'm that's what I require of sponsees also, and that they have to be plugged into the basics. And if they're not plugged into the basics, then we're not even going to go into working the steps, and because those basics of the program is foundational and important for our longevity in sobriety. So 2 years into my sobriety, 3 years, and I'm plugged in and I'm good, and I made amends to like my family and my grandma, and my grandma started showing up to things, you know, that woman that kicked me out of the house, and my dad ended up stopped drinking when my brother died, and so he has just as much sobriety, I guess, or than I do, because he hasn't taken a drink in almost 30 years. And that relationship with my dad started to get better, and I started having that relationship with him and my family, and me and my wife had about 3-4 years of sobriety. My mom, when she died, had left. She was on what we call Hawaiian homestead. It's almost kind of like the Native American, you know, homestead or reservations type of thing, but in Hawaii there's a similar thing. And my mom was on the list to get a home or property for over 20 years. And just so happened, when I was about 3-4 years sober, I got a call from them saying, hey, you're up on the list. They're building some new houses and da-da-da-da-da. And, you know, are you interested? And so we went and qualified for a loan, and I bought my first home when I was about 4 years sober. And, man, that was the cheapest house I ever had, and it was on Hawaiian homestead land, and it was on the west side of Oahu, in Nanakuli, and I was a homeowner, and my dad and my grandma helped, and all this stuff, and me and my wife moved in, and the kids, and wow, we had this home, and man, things was, and at that time I got a job with the state Department of Public Safety. I was working in the prisons, working with convicted felons. There's this 23, 24-year-old working with hardcore felons, man. I was as a counselor, and so I started my career counseling, and I was at that point I was working for the Department of Public Safety in the prisons, and I was doing that, and I stayed there at that job for 12 years, and I worked for a therapeutic community program called Cashbox, and that's where most of my career was, and me and my wife was, you know, we had good lives. We're plugged into the program. Our kids were in school. They were active in sports, things of that nature. And I mean, sobriety and the life, and I was sponsoring guys. It was the camp outs, and I mean, recovery was number one focus, and all that stuff. And that's what we did. When me and my wife had gone together early on, I wanted to start having kids, and we decided, and she had suggested that we wait until the kids got older, so that I wouldn't put all the focus on my kids, you know. And I as a stepchild, I understood that. I understood when, you know, the new family comes along, you know, and that becomes the priority. And I said, okay. So we waited, and we did this life called recovery and sobriety, and both of us had good jobs with the state, and we had our home, and we're plugged into the program, and life was going along, and my career started to advance, and I got promoted a few times, and somewhere around year 8 or 9, I was trying to get this supervisor position, and I couldn't qualify for it because I didn't have a degree. And my sponsor said, well, if you're going to want to advance your career, you're going to need to go to college. And I was deathly afraid of college. I was deathly afraid of school. And here I am at 9-10 years of sobriety going, what the heck am I going to do? I'm a special ed student. How am I supposed to do this thing called school? You know, I still struggled with comprehension and understanding things, and I still had a lot of fears and anxieties over school and education and all that stuff. And he said, you're going to do it the same way you've been doing the program. One thing at a time, one day at a time, one assignment at a time, one paper at a time, and that's what you're going to do. And so I enrolled in college at the University of Phoenix, and I got that degree. I got a bachelor's degree in about 4 years. And after I finished that bachelor's degree, they asked if I wanted to do the master's program, so I did that. And I finished my MBA. And then after that, they said, hey, why don't you go into the doctoral program? So I went into a doctoral program, and I did that for about 4 years, and then took a break. But I went on this whole education route, and still plugged into the program, and I started wanting to have kids. And my wife, I ended up finding out that my wife didn't want to have any kids. And then we found out that she couldn't have any kids. And we tried in vitro, and we tried all kinds of things. During that time, it was a very tough time. We went through a couple of separations during that time, all around this whole thing. And I don't know why, and I do now, but during that time, I just had this desire and this drive to want to have kids. And I'm not exactly sure, where that was coming from at the time, but it was strong. And it was more important than anything that was happening in my life at the time. No matter what was going on, all the good stuff, being married, being plugged into the program, having a home, all that stuff didn't matter. All that was on my mind was I needed to have a kid. Kids. And so when we found out that we wasn't going to be able to have any kids, my kids were already in high school. My son was already graduating from high school. And I decided to stay in the marriage and stay there until my kids graduated from high school. So my son graduated. He went off to Fresno to college. And my daughter had graduated. And after she had graduated, I made a decision to ask my wife for a divorce. After 17 years of being together at the time, I asked her for a divorce. And we were separated. And I had her at the house. She stayed at the house, and she stayed at the house, and I was at my dad's. And a couple of weeks into it, I used to go home sometimes after to pick up clothes and stuff, and then I would leave. And this one day, she had called and asked if I was coming home, and I said yeah. And something came up, and I wasn't able to go home, so I went straight to my dad's. And I got a call later from a neighbor telling me that I needed to come home. And after pleading with her why, she had told me that my wife had committed suicide. She had hung herself in her garage and died. And so I sped off to our home, and I had to identify her body. And they had her lying in the garage. And that was quite an experience. My son was in Fresno. My daughter was the one that found her hanging when she came home from work. And that turned our family upside down. And there was another experience that had happened when I had about 15 years of sobriety, I think I had, somewhere around there. Me and my wife and the kids had gone over to my mom's family's house for Easter Sunday. And, probably had about 15 years of sobriety at the time. And my aunt, my mom's sister, when we went over, she was like, hey, how you doing? They used to call me, they still call me Benny. Hey, Benny, how you doing? And how's your dad? And I said, good. And, and she goes, your dad's not your real dad, huh? And I was like, what? And they proceeded to tell me, so I was like, what are you guys talking about? And we got into this whole conversation. And so I asked them, I said, do you guys know who my biological dad is? And they said, yeah. And they said it was this guy named Paul. And I asked Paul who, and they told me his last name. And I said, is he this? Is he that? And they're like, yeah. They go, why, you know him? I said, yeah, I know him. He's been a friend of mine for 15 years. Well, Paul, when I first started counseling for Frank at A Second Chance, when my first client that I had in my career of counseling was Paul. He was a convicted felon, drug addict, heroin addict, hardcore, and he was about 20, 21 years older than I was. And he was my first client that I counseled. And over the years, me and Paul became friends, and he didn't stay sober after that, but he did come back later, and I think he has about 25 years now of sobriety. And when he came back, we lived on the same side of the island, and we just became really good friends. And so I told my aunt them, I said, yeah, I know Paul. Paul's a really good friend of mine. You guys are telling me that he's my biological father. They said, yep, that's what your mom told us. And everybody on my mom's side of the family knew, except for me and my dad. So after that conversation, I called my dad and I said, hey, Dad, this is what I just got told. And I said, do you know about this? And he was like, no. And he was quite upset about it and about why they had said anything at this point and all this kind of stuff. And so after that phone call, I called Paul and I told Paul, I said, hey, I said, do you know a woman by the name of, I told him my mom's name, and he was like, wow, I haven't heard that name in a long time. I said, you know who that is? And he was like, yeah. I said, well, this is what I just got told. And Paul never knew my mom in all the years, because my mom had died, when I had 90 days. And so Paul, we never had a discussion about who my mom was or anything like that. And he said, yeah. And I asked him, I said, were you ever intimate with my mom? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, maybe it's true. And so we started on this journey, on this path of him being my biological father. And I was so angry and so confused and going through all kinds of emotions and feelings about this whole scenario that I went in. I didn't believe what my family was telling me, and I went and had me and my dad would take a DNA test. And my dad said, whatever you need me to do, help support you, I'll do it. And we went, and it was confirmed that my dad, who I grew up with, my mom was first married to, wasn't my biological father. And so we just continued on this whole thing, and I think that fed the whole wanting to have kids even more so now. I was like, these crazy people, the crazy upbringing that I have. I don't even know who my dad is. It's Paul now, and and all this kind of stuff, and just kind of went along this journey. And after my wife had committed suicide, and we went through some ups and downs with that, and my daughter tried to commit suicide herself a few times, and I had to admit her into the psych unit and all this stuff. And my son, just lost, and both of my kids just got lost, and they went on their lives, and they wanted to move on, and they were adults now, and they wanted to go do what they wanted to go do, and that's what they did. I went on this search and this hunt of trying to find a woman that wanted to have kids and didn't have kids, and I went on about a good 3-4 year, trying to find somebody I can start a family with and all this stuff. And by that time, I was about 40 years old. And after going through some insanity in my sobriety around this whole ordeal and dating and all this kind of stuff, I took a break. And at this point, I'd moved around in my career and had done a lot of different things in the addiction, behavioral health arena, and I got hired for this high-end private rehab center in Hawaii Kai on the island of Oahu, and the program director. And after about a year or so, the owners had closed the business down. And a woman that was our intake person lived in California, and me and her had gone along, and we became good friends. And when the program was closing, she said, would you be willing to move to California if I could, find you a job up here? I said, yeah, I'd love to move to California. And sure sure enough, she got me an interview with the guy that owned the treatment center in Corona del Mar, California, and he flew me up for an interview, and came up for the weekend, stayed at the facility, did an evaluation, did a consultation of the program. I looked at what I thought needed to be done, some of the good, some of the bad, my recommendations, all this kind of stuff. And on the last day, in driving me back to LAX, he offered me the job. So I said, well, this is what I need, and I went home, quit my job, packed up my stuff, a couple of suitcases, and by that Saturday, I was living in California and running this facility. And that started my journey here in California. And what I did here was the same thing that I did back home. I got plugged in. I found a meeting. I stayed with my sponsor back home in Hawaii, got in service, still working the steps, sponsees, all that stuff. As far as my recovery, through all of these things that had happened, I was always really active and really involved in the program. And that hasn't changed. Even when I was going to school and all that stuff and raising my kids, I was going to school, had a full-time job, and in recovery, plugged in, and I had learned how to be able to do all those types of things, clean and sober, one thing at a time. And I was able to do all that stuff, and I enjoyed my career, and I enjoyed what I was doing, and I was getting educated, and I was just, living a really productive life. I got sober when I was 20 years old, so there was a lot of life to live, and it wasn't being wasted by alcohol and drugs, I was spending my time getting to know who I was, learning about me, trying to get better, trying to get educated, trying to build a career, trying to have a family, everything that anybody would want, in life, and that's the path that I was on. So I had about 21 years of sobriety. I moved to California and started on this whole new journey of being at a place that I'd never been before, having to meet new people and new friends, and I built the fellowship here for myself, and this is where I met my second wife. She had actually come in. I was running this program, and she came in for an interview for a therapist position, and she was a therapist, and I remember the first time I saw her, I was just like, wow, this is a very beautiful woman. And I was like, hey, get focused, do the interview. And me and the clinical director did the interview. And we asked her to come back for a second interview. And between the first and the second, she had called and said that she had changed her mind. And what I did was I asked her out on a date. And we went out for coffee. And we hit it off. And that was in January 7th. And 9 years ago. 8 years ago, sorry. And we've been together ever since. And I took her home to meet the family. After a couple of weeks of dating, I was just so happened had a trip planned back home, and I asked her if she wanted to go, so she went home with me, and she met the entire Kaniakala clan and all my family back home, and we just hit it off. And 3 months into the relationship, she had gotten pregnant. And so we moved in together and all this stuff. And I'm like 40 years old, 20 years sober, having my first child. And, 9 months later, we had my first child, my daughter, Phoenix. And one of the greatest things that ever happened to me, in my life and in my sobriety besides my recovery. And it came true, I finally had my first child. And we both had really good careers here in California, and almost 3 years later, we got pregnant again, and we had our youngest, our daughter, Faith. So I have my oldest, who's 7, and my youngest, who's 4, Phoenix and Faith, and my wife. And been living in California since then. And last year, I got asked to speak at the 57th annual Hawaii AA convention, and Paul, my bio dad, was going to be the person that was going to announce me, and he did actually announce me as the speaker, as one of the main speakers at the Hawaii convention last Hawaii convention, um, Paul and his sister, my aunt, had contacted me and said, "Hey, I have a, I knew I had a half sister, Paul. Paul had another daughter, and I said, oh, she's a drug addict too, and she's lost her kids, and there was a baby of hers that was about a year old that they were trying to place with family, and my bio dad, Paul, and my aunt had asked if I was interested." And I said, yeah. So I contacted Child Protective Services in Honolulu and in Hawaii, and I said, I'm the mom's, half brother and all this kind of stuff. And I said, do you have any proof? And I said, no, I don't. So, well, you need to go and get a DNA test, one that can, approved by the courts and stuff. So me and Paul went and pursued getting a DNA test. And, I'd never done a DNA test with Paul. I always thought that, it was pretty, my entire family was pretty sure it was him and didn't have any doubts about it. And so me and Paul did the DNA test, and I pursued this whole thing of getting the baby, and we got the results back, and Paul wasn't my biological father either. So my dad wasn't my biological father, Paul wasn't my biological father, and I went to the Hawaii convention and shared about that new discovery, because everybody back home knew that Paul was my dad, my bio dad, and I just found out during that time that he wasn't, right before I went back home for that convention. So I was in this whole thing of, okay, what the heck, I'm married here in California, I got 2 kids, I don't know who my bio dad was, shall I just leave it alone? My dad will always be my dad, none of this changes that relationship, I love my dad, he's been there with me through everything, throughout my sobriety, and I love the man, and he's my kid's grandfather, and and all this stuff, and that's not going to change that. Well, just so happened, my kids are they're in a dance studio, or they love dancing. My wife was a dancer before, and so she teaches dance at this place, and one of the moms had shared with my wife one day that she had used somebody out of New Jersey to help her find her biological parents because she was adopted when she was a baby. And she said, and she was my wife was telling her about my situation, and she was like, yeah, if you want, I can give you her contact information. So a couple months went by, and I said, okay, yeah, let's try and engage this and try and find out. So I called her, and she was in New Jersey, and I told her my story and a little bit, and she said, yeah, I can find your biological father. And she said, you do Ancestry, 23andMe, and all that kind of stuff? I said, yeah. And she had disclosed to me it should take me anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months to find your biological dad, just because. And I said, okay, I gotta see this. Like, I was thinking, he was from Hawaii, all this kind of stuff, and, I didn't know what, and all that kind of stuff. It took the woman 2 weeks to find my biological father through my DNA on Ancestry.com. And he had not taken the test, so he didn't come up, but she had called me up and said, I am 100% guaranteed that this is your biological father. And she proceeded to tell me who he was, where he was, his story, and he's from Minnesota, born and raised in St. Paul. And the only thing that we didn't know was how he and my mom met. How did they conceive me? And so she asked me if I wanted to call him, or if I wanted her to call, and I said, I think you should. I'm sure he's going to have a lot of questions. And so she proceeded to call. She left 3 messages, and then he finally, after about a week, I think, had contacted her back, and they started the conversation, and he wanted to speak with me, and he was open to the whole situation. So Super Bowl Sunday of this year, I had met my biological father, Jim, for the first time. And we started talking, and I started telling him my story, and he has a son and a daughter. So I have a half brother and a half sister in Minnesota. And I started connecting with them. I started connecting with my half sister there, and we just started on this path of getting to know each other. And a few months ago, I took my first trip to Minnesota to meet the family, and I stayed there for a few days and got to meet a side of me that I never knew existed. And I truly believe that if it wasn't for my sobriety and my recovery, none of this would be even possible. And so we're in regular communication with my new family in Minnesota. And it's just so happened he was a Marine and was stationed on Oahu while he was there for 2 years. And that's how he met my mom. So that's how they met. They didn't really go out very much. He actually vaguely remembers her. And he was never told that he was going to be a father. So back in the day, my mom had made a decision that she had met my dad and decided that my dad was going to be my dad. And that was going to be it. It was going to be, she took that to her grave. And through technology and, the ancestry stuff, the DNA stuff and all that, I was able to find out who my biological father is and genetics and all that kind of stuff. And it's been quite an amazing journey, My wife's continued her education also, and she's a psychologist and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And about 5 years ago, when I first started out in this industry of addiction 30 years ago, I always had the dream of opening up my own treatment center. And 5 years ago, after going through some tough situations at some treatment centers that I was working with here in California, me and my wife decided that we would open up our treatment center. So our treatment center is called Phoenix Rising Behavioral Healthcare Services, and we're located in Aliso Viejo, California. And I started off with me and my wife, helped out here and there. She had her own private practice going, and so I ran all the groups, and we rented this little office that was about 500 square foot, and it was my group room, therapy room, intake room, counseling room, everything. It was and that's how we started Phoenix Rising. My treatment center is named after my oldest girl, Phoenix, of course, and we've been open for about 4 years now, going in our 5th year, and it's been quite a journey. And all those degrees and all that kind of stuff and all of my experiences of working in the field have definitely helped us in what we're doing and how we're doing it. There's a lot of people in California opening up treatment centers that have very little to no experience nor credentials opening and owning and operating treatment centers and doing a lot of harm to people who are struggling with addiction. And me and my wife said that we would not get caught up in all this craziness and insanity and unethical practices and body brokering and all this type of stuff that's been going on here in California. And we decided not to do all of that. And we've been running a small, intimate IOP program. And we also have a private practice called Fate Behavioral, which is my youngest daughter's name, Behavioral Healthcare Services. And we have websites, PhoenixRisingBehavioral.com and FateBehavioral.com. And we just started up a nonprofit called the Malama Foundation. And then we have a sober living for men and women called A Second Chance. So over the past 4 years, we've grown a little bit, and we're still a very small, intimate, family-oriented program, and that's what we do. And that's what I do every day, and that's what me and my wife, we work together, and we love what we do. We love helping people. So that's, in a nutshell, that's been my 50 years of my journey through addiction and abuse and all all these things, and sobriety and recovery, and how important, my recovery is, and that's why I was saying, like in the beginning, the basics of the program have been the most consistent, stable thing that I've had in my entire life. While life's changing, people are changing, the world's changing, the program is changing too, but its principles in the 12-step program hasn't changed. And no matter what's going on, I can always go back to the basics. I can always go back to the practice, and that's what I've done. That no matter what's going on, the good, the bad, the indifferent that's going on in my sobriety, that's been the most consistent, stable thing in my life. And it's what continues to encourage me to continue changing. I do see a therapist also for just professional insight and trying to improve me, and trying to be a better father, trying to be a better husband, trying to be a better employer, trying to be a better friend, just to be a better person in this world, and to try and be an example of sobriety and recovery, and to continue working on those shortcomings and the selfishness and the pride and the ego. And just because we stop drinking and using, or we work the program once or twice, the steps and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't mean that your character defects go away. Those character defects are God-given, and they don't go away. And if I don't stay on top of them, and I don't continue doing what I need to do to take care of myself, those things will come right back. I've seen people with 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years relapse, go back to drinking and using again, because they stopped working on themselves. They stopped doing the program. Next thing you know, they're not going to meetings anymore. They're not calling their sponsor anymore. They're not working the steps anymore. They're not in service anymore. They're not praying and meditating anymore. Slowly but surely, you start taking the power back, and you start thinking that you are the power again. And yes, we have power to change what we need to change in us, and to maintain our character, and to continue working on building our character. That's my responsibility, nobody else's. And I can't go blaming anything or anybody or the world or this or that or whatever for the things that are going on, in my life and around me. I do the best I can at trying to be of service and trying to help people and trying to maintain my sobriety. And the hope is that I'll be able to do that and stay sober at the same time. And I've been able to use technology today. There's an app that I've used over the past year or so called Marco Polo, and I've been able to sponsor a few men that live on the one of the groups that I'm a part of on Marco Polo is a group of sponsees that I have on the Big Island of Hawaii, on Oahu, and one on Kauai. And we're able to work the steps. I've worked the steps with them on this app. And it's something that we do every day, and we check in, and they check in, and we check on what we're doing and what we're applying in our lives as a result of what we're studying in the steps and all that stuff. And we've been able to do a step study that way, and to hold each other accountable for character building, and not taking the power back, and resting on our laurels, and and all that kind of stuff, but pushing and continuing to grow and change. There's always things that can be changed. There's always growth that can happen. When my sponsor early on had told me this one thing, it's kind of the thing that I've been stuck on for years is the good is the enemy of the better. And there's going to be a lot of times and a lot of instances and situations where life's going to be good. And I cannot stop at good. I have to continually go after the better. And I'm not talking about material good, and it can be seen in that way too, but I'm talking about personal growth good. That when things get good, and I'm working on some things and things seem to be leveling off, I'm always looking at setting my expectations or my standards for my recovery, because each of my character traits also have, as I get older in my sobriety, there's levels of unmanageability with them. And so what I do every time is because I'm always setting new standards to meet and expectations. And there's more than enough to work on the rest of my life. And that's kind of been the way that I've seen and worked in my recovery. And that's worked for me, and that's what I continue to do, and that's what I teach the guys that I sponsor back home. And all the guys that I sponsor back home have 20 plus years of sobriety. And we're digging into our defects of character and instincts and character building every day. And we're involved in the basics. We're involved in the basics of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's a mandate. And without that, I don't have the power to do all the things that I'm going to need to do to address me and to change me. So all of those items or all of those things or those principles within the basics help me, gives me the courage and the strength to do, and hopefully align those defects of character to some God-given ideals, and that's always growing, that's never ending. Character building is never ending. Working on myself is never ending. I'm not comparing myself today and what I'm going through in my sobriety to me drinking and using 30 years ago. I'm not drinking. I haven't drank and used drugs for 30 years. Why am I going to focus on and compare myself to, oh, look how good I am. Look, I'm not drinking and using. That was 30 years ago. How's about looking at what I did a year ago in my defects of character and start working on those? I can still be selfish, self-centered, ego, pride. I can still act out, behave like an asshole in my sobriety. So I cannot continue working on me. And that's why I continue to do. And again, this is just for me. You might not think so, and that's fine too. You know what I mean? But this is what I do for me. And so that when things like finding out about my bio dad or having kids and all that kind of stuff comes, or we're having struggles in the business or whatever it might be, that I'm prepared. I'm prepared as I can be in taking care of myself and my sobriety, so that I can learn how to respond to those things rather than to react to them or say screw it or make it even way worse than it should be. And I owe that to the program, and I owe that to being plugged into the program and this desire and willingness that I still have to stay clean and sober and to continue working on me. And that's what I continue to try and teach at our treatment center with the clients that come in. And I love meeting and meeting my alumni that are got 2 years, 3 years, over 3 years of sobriety, and watching their lives change and all that kind of stuff. That's exciting stuff for me. Watching people's lives change. So that's my story. I'm sure there's a lot more to say. Again, if you're in California or you're needing help or whatever, and you need someone to talk to or just needing some help or whatever, or some guidance or whatever it might be, again, you can go to our website, at phoenixrisingbehavioral.com, and all of our contact information is there. And I just want to thank Shane for asking me to be a part of this platform and sharing my story of addiction and recovery. And it's always an honor and a privilege to be able to do that. So I'm truly grateful.